I knew the moment her tires hit my gravel again, something was going to snap, not the gate this time, but the illusion that she could keep doing whatever she wanted on my land. Because at exactly 6:42 a.m., before the sun even cleared the oak line, I heard that familiar crunch, then the low growl of her engine, and then the metallic groan as my ranch gate bent inward like it had been waiting for impact. Dust rising in a dry cloud that tasted like rust and dirt on my tongue, and there she was. Brenda Whitmore, hands steady on the wheel of that spotless white SUV, not slowing, not even pretending to hesitate, just pushing through like the boundary didn't exist, like my property line was nothing more than a suggestion, and I stood there 20 yards away with a wrench still in my hand from the repair I'd finished the night before, watching the hinges twist out of alignment again, hearing that sharp ping of stressed metal that I'd come to recognize way too well, and for a second, everything went quiet except the ticking of her engine cooling as she rolled past like she owned the place, like she hadn't just driven straight through something I built with my own hands. And that's when it hit me. Not anger, not even frustration, but clarity, the kind that settles in your chest heavy and cold. Because this wasn't an accident. It never had been. This was routine. This was her shortcut, her convenience, her belief that a ranch gate was just an inconvenience she could remove whenever she felt like it. And I realized something standing there with dust still hanging in the air and the smell of hot rubber fading. If I fixed that gate again, I was just resetting the clock for the next time she decided to drive through it, and the time after that, and the time after that, until there was nothing left but splintered posts and bent steel and a line in the dirt that meant nothing to her. So I didn't move, I didn't yell, I didn't chase her down the road like I had once. Before, I just looked at what was left of that gate, leaned slightly off-center, chain dragging, latch hanging loose like it had given up trying to hold, and I let out a slow breath as the morning wind pushed the dust across the pasture behind me, because in that exact moment, I knew I wasn't going to fix it again, I wasn't going to argue, and I sure wasn't going to ask permission, because what Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't see from behind that windshield or from her HOA meetings or her neat little maps of what she thought this land should be, was that I had already started measuring, already started planning, already pulled every county code and boundary record I needed, and the next time she came down that road expecting an open path, expecting that same weak point she could break through without consequence, she was going to find something very different waiting for her, something that didn't bend, didn't shift, and didn't care how many times she tried to push past it. I have lived on this land long enough to know every sound it makes, the way gravel shifts under weight, the way wind moves through the fence posts at dusk, the way a hinge should close clean when it is set right, and that gate, the one she kept driving through, was built by my father 30 years ago with timber he cut himself, and steel he welded in our old barn when I was barely tall enough to hold the flashlight steady. And I can still remember the smell of hot metal and sawdust mixing in the air while he told me that a gate is not just something you pass through. It is something that tells the world where you stop and I begin. And for years that gate stood exactly where it was supposed to, keeping cattle in, keeping trouble out, marking a clean line between my ranch and everything else creeping in from the outside, until the subdivisions started showing up like weeds after rain, neat rows of houses, identical roofs. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Brenda Whitmore with her clipboard smile and that tone of voice that sounded polite until you listened closely enough to hear the edge underneath, the kind of voice that assumes it already has the final say. She moved in, and within a month there were letters, notices, suggestions about community access and shared pathways, words that sounded harmless until you realized they all pointed toward one thing, control. And the first time she mentioned my gate, it was casual, almost friendly, saying it would be more convenient if there was easier access through my property, like she was asking for a favor instead of testing a boundary, and I told her no. Simple as that. Because no is a complete sentence when it comes to your own land. But she did not hear it that way. Not really. Because people like Brenda do not register no as an answer, they treat it like a delay, something to work around, something to eventually override. And sure enough, a week later, I found tire marks cutting too close to the post. Then a few days after that, the latch bent just enough that it would not sit right. Small things at first, easy to fix, easy to dismiss if you wanted to believe in coincidence. But I have spent my life reading signs in dirt and wood and steel, and there is no such thing as coincidence when patterns start forming, and each time I repaired that gate, I did it stronger, tighter, cleaner, resetting the hinge, reinforcing the post, adjusting the chain so it held firm, thinking maybe if it was solid enough she would respect it. But respect was never part of her calculation, because to her that gate was not a boundary, it was an inconvenience, and the more solid I made it, the more it seemed to challenge her, like she took it personally that something on my land was telling her she could not pass. And now standing there after another impact, looking at the slight lean in the post and the scrape marks where her bumper had pushed through again, I realized the truth I should have accepted from the start. I was not dealing with someone who misunderstood the line. I was dealing with someone who believed the line did not apply to her at all. And that meant whatever I built next could not just be stronger, it had to be final. Brenda did not slow down after that morning. If anything, she got more comfortable, like each time she crossed my land without consequence confirmed whatever story she was telling herself about ownership and authority, and I started seeing it in the details, the way her tire tracks cut deeper into the same path, the way the grass flattened into a permanent line like a road that had never been approved but somehow existed anyway, the way she would not even glance toward the house anymore as she passed through, like I was already erased from the equation. And a few days later a letter showed up in my mailbox, crisp white envelope, HOA letterhead printed in bold at the top, the kind of paper that smells like fresh ink and quiet assumptions. And inside it talked about community access improvement and shared easements, about enhancing connectivity and reducing travel time. All words carefully chosen to sound reasonable until you realized none of it had anything to do with permission. It was written like a decision had already been made and I was just being informed after the fact. And I stood there at my kitchen counter reading it while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, feeling that same cold clarity settle in again, because this was not about a shortcut anymore. This was about turning my boundary into their convenience permanently. And later that week I saw survey flags near the edge of my property line, thin orange markers pushed into the soil like someone had already started measuring something that did not belong to them. And that is when I drove into town, not to argue, not to complain, but to pull records, because I wanted facts that did not depend on anyone's opinion. And the county office smelled like paper and old wood. Rows of files stacked behind a counter where a clerk barely looked up as I asked for my parcel map, and when they handed it over I spread it out right there, running my finger along the line that had not moved in decades. The same line my father showed me when I was a kid. The same line that gate had marked all these years. And there it was in black and white, clean, exact, unambiguous. No shared access, no easement, no right-of-way granted to anyone beyond that boundary. And I asked about building regulations next, setback requirements, height limits, materials, everything that governed what a man could legally put on his own land. And the answers came back simple and solid. As long as I stayed within the code, the county did not care what I built along my own line. And walking back out into the sunlight with those documents in my hand, I could feel something shift, because for the first time this was not about reacting to what Brenda had done. It was about deciding what I was going to do next. And when I got home, I did not touch the broken gate. I did not straighten the post or fix the latch. I just walked the length of that boundary slowly, boots pressing into the dirt, measuring steps, marking points in my head, listening to the wind move across the open field like it always had. And I could already see it taking shape. Not another repair, not another temporary fix, but something that would stand where that gate kept failing, something that would make the line visible in a way no one could ignore. And as the sun dropped lower and the shadows stretched across the ground, I knew exactly where the first post was going to go. I did not start building the next day, not because I was unsure, but because rushing would have made it look like a reaction, and I needed this to be something else entirely, something deliberate, something that would hold up not just against her tires, but against every rule she thought she could twist. So instead I spent that first morning sitting on the tailgate of my truck with a tape measure stretched across the dirt, marking out distances in inches and feet, double-checking the setback from the property line, making sure every point I planned to touch was exactly where the county map said it should be, because I was not just building a barrier, I was building something that could not be argued away. And by noon I had stakes in the ground, small wooden markers spaced evenly along the boundary, each one driven in with a steady rhythm that echoed across the quiet pasture. And by the time the sun hit its highest point, the outline was there, invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, but perfectly clear to me, a straight line where the old gate had failed over and over again. And that afternoon I drove into town again, not to the county office this time, but to the supply yard, the kind that smells like cut lumber, diesel, and sun-baked concrete. And I loaded up steel posts thick enough to hold real weight, rebar for reinforcement, bags of concrete mix stacked heavy in the bed of my truck, the kind of materials you do not use unless you intend something to last. And the guy at the counter raised an eyebrow when he rang it up, asked if I was building a retaining wall or something bigger, and I just said I was fixing a boundary, because that was the simplest way to explain it without getting into everything that had led up to this. And when I got back to the ranch, the air had that late afternoon heat that makes everything feel still and heavy, and I started digging. Each hole measured, each depth consistent, the shovel biting into dry soil with a dull thud that sent small vibrations up through my hands, and sweat ran down my back as I worked. But there was something steady about it, something controlled, like every inch I dug was reclaiming ground that had been taken for granted, and I kept my pace even, not rushing, not stopping, just working through the line one post at a time, and somewhere in the distance I heard the faint sound of an engine, that same familiar tone I had come to recognize without even looking. And I did not turn right away. I just set the shovel down, wiped the dust from my hands, and then glanced up as her white SUV rolled into view, slowing for the first time in weeks as it approached the line of stakes. And she stopped just short of where the gate used to stand, engine idling, watching me in a way she never had before, like she was trying to understand what she was looking at, and I could feel her eyes on me as I picked up the next post, set it into the ground, and adjusted it until it stood perfectly straight. And for a moment neither of us said anything, just the quiet hum of her engine and the distant rustle of wind through dry grass. And then she stepped out, heels pressing into the dirt that had never been meant for them, and asked in that same smooth voice what exactly I thought I was doing. And I looked at the line of posts, at the space where her shortcut used to be, and then back at her. And for the first time since this started, I did not explain. I just said I was finishing something that should have been finished a long time ago. She did not like that answer. I could see it in the way her smile tightened just enough to lose that polished edge, like something underneath was starting to show. And she took a step closer, heels pressing deeper into the loose dirt around my markers, looking down the line of posts like she was trying to find a flaw she could point at, something she could turn into a rule violation or a complaint. And when she spoke again, her tone shifted, still calm on the surface, but carrying that quiet authority she always leaned on, the kind that assumes it does not need to be questioned. She said this looked like a structure, and structures required approval, that the HOA had standards for exterior changes, that anything affecting community access had to be reviewed. And I let her finish without interrupting, just listening to the words stack up one after another like they had weight, even though I already knew they did not apply here, because while she was talking I could still feel the folded county documents in my back pocket, the exact measurements, the clear language that did not leave room for interpretation. And when she paused, I reached back, pulled them out, and handed her a copy without a word, the paper catching slightly in the breeze as she took it. And for the first time since I had known her, she went quiet, eyes scanning the lines, following the boundary marks, the setback requirements, the section that spelled it out plain: private property, no shared easement, no obligation to provide access. And I watched the moment land, not like a sudden shock, but like something sinking in slow, heavy, undeniable. And she tried to recover. Of course she did, saying that even if it was technically allowed, it was not in the spirit of the community, that cooperation mattered, that blocking what had become a commonly used path would create issues. And that was when I realized something else. She was not talking about law anymore. She was talking about expectation, about what she had grown used to taking without resistance. And I looked past her at the faint tire marks cutting through the grass, the path she had carved by repetition, and then back at the posts I had already set, straight, solid, evenly spaced. And I told her that convenience does not change ownership. And for a second the air between us felt different, quieter, like the ground had shifted just enough to throw her balance off. And she did not argue right away. She just folded the paper once, then again, more out of habit than intention, and said we would see what the board had to say about it. Like that would settle something. Like that still carried the same weight it used to. And I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I did not need to argue. Not anymore. Because everything that mattered was already set in motion. and as she turned and walked back to her SUV, the door closing with a soft thud that sounded smaller than it used to, I picked up the shovel again, stepped to the next mark, and kept working, the rhythm returning, steady, controlled, each post going in exactly where it was supposed to, and behind me, I heard her engine start, idle for a moment longer than usual, and then pull away without crossing the line. And that was the first time since this started that she chose not to drive through. The next morning started earlier than usual, the kind of quiet that settles over the land before the sun rises, when the air feels cooler and every sound carries a little farther, and I was already out there before first light, boots planted in the dirt, hands wrapped around the handle of a post hole digger, working the same line I had marked the day before, each hole spaced exact, each depth measured down to the inch. Because if this was going to stand, it had to be right from the ground up. And as the sky slowly shifted from black to that pale blue just before sunrise, the first mix of concrete went in, thick and heavy, the smell sharp and earthy as I poured it around the base of the steel post and set it straight, checking the level twice. Then once more for good measure, because crooked now meant weak later, and weak was not an option anymore, and I moved down the line like that for hours, one post, then the next, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of work replacing the frustration that had been building for weeks, and by mid-morning the first section stood anchored, a row of steel rising clean out of the ground where the old gate had once been the only thing holding the line, and I could feel the difference already, not just in strength but in presence, like the boundary had weighed again, like it meant something again, and around noon I heard a vehicle slow down on the road beyond the fence line, not Brenda this time, just a neighbor passing by, slowing enough to look, to take in what was changing, and then moving on without saying a word. And that was fine, because this was not for them. This was not for the neighborhood or the board or anyone who thought they had a say in how I managed my land. This was for the line itself, the one that had been ignored one too many times. And I kept going, mixing more concrete, setting more posts, the sun climbing higher until the heat settled heavy on my shoulders, sweat running down my arms and soaking into the dust. But I did not stop, not when I knew. Momentum mattered, not when I could already see the shape of it forming. And sometime in the late afternoon, just as I was tightening the brace on another post, I heard that engine again, slower this time, cautious, and I did not need to turn to know it was her. The sound alone told me everything. And she did not drive forward like before, she stopped short again, this time farther back, as if the line of steel in front of her had already changed something in her calculation. And I let the silence stretch, kept working without acknowledging her at first, letting her watch as each piece went into place, as the gap she used to take for granted narrowed into something solid, something intentional. And when I finally looked up, she was still there, hands on the wheel, not speaking, just watching. And for the first time since this started, it felt like she was not deciding what to do next. It felt like she was trying to figure out what she could still do at all. By the third day, the line was no longer just posts in the ground. It had presence, weight, something you could feel before you even got close to it. And I had started setting the horizontal steel beams between each post, welding them clean. Each seemed bright for a second before cooling into a solid connection that did not flex when I leaned into it. And the sound of the welder filled the air in sharp bursts. That electric crack followed by the faint smell of heated metal drifting across the field. And I worked through it steady, visor down, hands firm, building section by section until the open space she used to drive through started to disappear, piece by piece. And every now and then I would step back, wipe the sweat from my face, and look at it from a distance, checking the line, making sure it stayed true. Because if there was one thing I had learned from watching my father build that old gate, it was that strength means nothing if it is not straight. And by late afternoon, the first solid span stood complete, not a gate, not something that could be pushed or bypassed, but a fixed barrier anchored deep. And that is when she came back. Again, this time slower than I had ever seen her drive. The white SUV rolling forward inch by inch until it reached the point where the open path used to be, and then stopping, engine idling, the sound low and uncertain, and I could see her through the windshield, eyes moving across the structure, taking in the change, measuring it in her own way. And I did not stop working. I kept welding the next section, sparks falling to the dirt in small bursts of light, letting her watch the process. Instead of just the result, And after a minute she opened the door, stepped out again. But this time there was no confidence in the way she moved, no immediate statement about rules or approvals, just a slower pace. Like she was trying to find footing in a situation that had shifted beyond what she expected, and she asked if I really thought this was necessary, her voice softer, less certain. And I paused just long enough to look at the stretch of steel, now blocking the exact path she had taken. For weeks, then back at her, and I told her that necessary stopped matching the moment respect did, and the words hung there for a second, not loud, not aggressive, just clear, and she did not answer right away. She just looked at the structure again, then at the ground where her tire marks ended short of it. And for the first time there was something else in her expression, not anger, not yet, but realization, like she was starting to understand that this was not something she could push through or talk around. And without another word, she turned back to her vehicle, got in, and after a brief pause, shifted into reverse instead of drive, the tires rolling back over the gravel the way they should have all along. And as she pulled away, leaving the boundary intact behind her, I lowered the visor again, struck another arc, and kept building, because I was not finished yet, not even close. By the time the fourth morning rolled in, the structure no longer looked like a project, it looked like a statement, the steel frame fully set, concrete cured hard around every base, and I had started layering in the stone facing, thick slabs stacked and anchored against the frame, each one adding weight, adding permanence, turning something functional into something undeniable. And the sound had changed too, no longer just the sharp crack of welding but the dull, solid thud of stone meeting steel, the scrape of edges locking into place, and the air carried that dry mineral smell that clings to your hands long after you stop working. And I moved along the line methodically, setting each piece with care, checking alignment, making sure there were no gaps, because this was not about speed, it was about finality. And sometime mid-morning a different sound cut through the rhythm, not the slow approach I had heard the past couple of days, but a quicker one, more familiar, more confident. And I did not need to turn to know she had decided to test it, because that is what people like Brenda do when something challenges their control. They push once more to see if it still gives, and I stepped back just enough to see her SUV roll forward, not fast, but with intent, like she expected this to be another version of the same obstacle she had broken before, and for a second there was that same alignment. The front of her vehicle pointed directly at the path she had carved into habit, the exact spot where the old gate used to swing open under pressure. And then she saw it clearly, not just posts, not just beams, but a finished wall rising in front of her, stone and steel fused together, straight, solid, and completely unmoved by her presence. And the engine sound shifted, that low hum turning into something uncertain as she eased closer, slowing more than she probably meant to, until she came to a stop just a few feet away, and the dust settled quietly around her tires instead of exploding outward like it used to. And I watched from a few steps back, arms relaxed at my sides, not saying anything, because there was nothing left to explain, and she sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, looking at the surface of the wall like she was searching for a weakness, a hinge, a seam, anything that would suggest it could be moved or bypassed. But there was none, just a continuous line that followed the boundary exactly. No gaps, no give. And after a long second she opened the door and stepped out, slower than before, the confidence gone from her posture, replaced by something tighter, more controlled, and she walked up to the wall, reached out, and placed her hand against the stone, testing it in the simplest way possible, and it did not respond. It did not shift or echo or hint at flexibility. It just stood there, cool and solid under her touch. And she pulled her hand back like she had just confirmed something she did not want to admit. And when she turned to look at me this time there was no argument ready, no mention of boards or approvals, just a quiet realization settling in. And I could see it as clearly as the line we were standing on. She was not deciding whether she could cross anymore. She was realizing she could not. And after a moment she got back into her SUV, shifted into reverse, and backed away slowly, the tires rolling over the same gravel she had ignored for weeks. And as she turned and drove back the way she came, leaving the wall untouched, I picked up the next stone, set it into place, and finished the section, because what stood there now was not just a barrier. It was the end of something that had gone on far too long. It was quiet the morning after I finished, the kind of quiet that feels earned, like something had finally settled back into place after being pushed too far for too long. And I stood there with my coffee in hand, leaning against the tailgate, looking at the line where the wall now ran clean and unbroken across the edge of my land, stone catching the early sunlight, steel holding everything tight underneath. And for the first time in weeks, there were no fresh tire marks cutting through the dirt, no bent hinges, no loose chains dragging in the dust, just a clear boundary that did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I could still remember the sound that used to wake me up, that low engine rolling in before sunrise, followed by the sharp metallic strain of something being pushed past its limit. And now there was none of that, just wind moving through the pasture and the distant call of birds settling into the trees. And sometime around mid-morning I saw her again, not coming down the path this time but stopping out on the road, the white SUV parked at a distance where the entire wall was visible, and she stayed there for a minute, maybe two, just looking, not trying to approach, not testing anything, just taking in what had changed. And I did not move toward her. I did not wave or acknowledge it. I just stood where I was and let the distance stay exactly as it should be, because that was the point of all of this. Not confrontation, not winning an argument, just restoring something that had been ignored. And after a while she drove off without turning toward the property at all, heading back the way she came. And I have not seen her try to cross since. Not once. And later that week another letter came in the mail. Same clean envelope, same official tone. But this time the wording was different, softer, talking about respecting established boundaries and encouraging communication between neighbors. And I read it once, then set it down on the table without much thought, because paper only matters when it matches reality. And reality was standing right outside my door, 40 feet of stone and steel that did not bend to opinion or convenience. And as the days passed, the grass along the old path started to lift again, slowly erasing the marks that had been pressed into it over time, and the land began to look the way it had before all of this started, uninterrupted, undivided, exactly as it was meant to be. And one evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the field, I walked the length of that wall, running my hand along the surface, feeling the rough texture of the stone, the solid resistance underneath. And I stopped at the exact spot where the old gate used to stand, where the hinges had twisted and the chain had dragged, and I realized something simple, something that had been there from the beginning. Boundaries only work when they are held, not argued, not explained, just built and maintained. And as I turned back toward the house, the last light catching along the top edge of the wall, I knew this was not just the end of her crossing that line. It was the end of her believing she ever could.